In today's video, you'll hear the story of a family who moved into a peaceful-looking house with a garden that held a secret far darker than they ever imagined. The story begins with the discovery of a swing that never stopped moving. In the early days of autumn, when the trees were shedding their brittle leaves and the air carried the faint smell of damp soil, Michael Johnson led his family into what was supposed to be their new beginning. The house stood in a quiet suburban neighborhood, its facade modest and inviting, painted in fading white that caught the last glow of the setting sun. To them, it looked like safety, a place to escape the exhaustion of the city and offer Daniel, their 12-year-old son, a childhood framed by open skies rather than concrete towers. Behind the house stretched a yard that seemed frozen in time, an overgrown garden lined with wild grass, a rusting fence leaning slightly to one side, and at its center, the object that would come to define their nights. An old wooden swing suspended by thick weathered chains from a skeletal frame of metal. It was the kind of object that stirred nostalgia, a relic of simpler days. Yet even as they first laid eyes on it, something about the swing unsettled Laura. The breeze was absent that evening, and yet the swing swayed slowly, creaking with a rhythm too deliberate to be dismissed. Daniel was the first to rush toward it, his sneakers crunching on dry leaves. His laughter echoed across the yard as he pushed the swing higher, oblivious to the way its movements seemed slightly off, not merely responding to his force, but continuing with an unnatural persistence. Laura stood at the threshold of the garden, her arms crossed against the sudden chill that slid across her skin. She told herself it was nothing, just an old swing, loose in its joints, responding to the weight of her child. Yet when Daniel abandoned it moments later, the swing did not rest. It kept moving back and forth, slower, yes, but steady, like a heartbeat refusing to die down. Michael noticed it too, though he shrugged it away with the same rationality he always employed. He guided Laura inside, promising her that they needed this house, this reset. Daniel, already enthralled by his discovery, lingered in the yard until the sun collapsed into shadow. Inside, the house was silent, its rooms spacious, but carrying the faint odor of mold that clung to closed-off places. The wooden floors groaned under their steps, and dust shimmered in the dying light that slipped through half-closed blinds. Everything felt dormant, waiting. Laura could not shake the image of the swing, still in motion, still whispering with its iron chains as if it had something to say. The first night in the new house came with a stillness that felt both comforting and uncanny. The Johnsons settled into their bedrooms with the exhaustion that always follows a long day of moving boxes and arranging furniture. Michael fell asleep quickly, lulled by the idea of fresh beginnings. Laura lay awake longer, staring at the pale ceiling, unable to silence the faint creak she thought she heard from outside. At first, she dismissed it as her mind exaggerating memories of the swing earlier that day. Yet as the hours crawled, the sound returned, not constant, but in intervals, as if the swing pushed itself and then paused, waiting, before repeating the motion. She got up, padded to the window and parted the curtains just enough to peer into the backyard. The moonlight fell directly over the swing. Its wooden seat rose and fell with a patient rhythm, though the air was unmoving. The trees, as still as painted scenery. Laura's breath clouded the glass as she leaned closer. The chains shivered faintly, as if pulled by unseen hands. She drew the curtains shut before she could watch longer. The following morning, Daniel raced to the backyard before breakfast. His voice, bright and unbothered, broke through the morning hush as he jumped onto the swing. To him, nothing about it was strange. Children rarely question the rules of objects that seem made for them. He pumped his legs, laughed into the crisp air, and called out to his parents to watch. Michael smiled, though distracted,
while Laura studied the swing with cautious eyes. Throughout the day, she tried to dismiss her unease. The kitchen needed arranging, the upstairs rooms needed curtains, and the smell of dampness had to be battled with open windows and cleaning supplies.
Still, whenever she glanced outside, the swing was never entirely still. Even when Daniel was far away, its seat shifted slightly, like lungs breathing beneath the weight of unseen flesh. That evening, Mrs. Evelyn Carter appeared at the fence, introducing herself with the warmth of a neighbor, but the hesitance of someone withholding. She was in her late 60s, her hair silver and her hands spotted with age. Laura invited her for tea, but Evelyn declined, glancing past her shoulder into the yard instead. Her gaze lingered on the swing, her lips tightening in a way that made Laura uneasy. "You've got children?" Evelyn asked, though she already knew. Laura nodded. Evelyn gave a small, brittle smile, and then said nothing more, retreating to her house across the street. The encounter left Laura with the impression that something had been left unsaid. That night, the creaking resumed. This time, it was not subtle. Laura woke Michael, who listened for a moment before sighing. "It's old wood," he muttered, though he did not sound convinced. They lay in silence until the creak came again, dragging through the walls like a heartbeat, out of sync with their own. Daniel, however, slept soundly, his face serene in the half-light, and outside, the swing rocked on, as though time itself had decided not to let it rest. Days bled into one another as the Johnson family tried to adjust to their new surroundings. The house seemed generous in its size, but its silence carried weight. Each room echoed with their movements as though they were intruders, disturbing something that had been asleep for too long. The swing became Daniel's obsession. Every afternoon he would rush to it, sometimes sitting, sometimes pushing it with his hands, watching it sway long after he had stepped away. Laura began to notice how Daniel lingered there, even when he was not riding it, staring at it with a strange sort of reverence. Once, when she called him inside, he didn't respond immediately. She found him standing in front of the swing, his head tilted slightly, as if listening. The chains trembled faintly, though no wind brushed the yard. She asked what he was doing, and he only shrugged, his eyes distant, before running back into the house. That evening, Laura couldn't bring herself to close the curtains. Instead, she sat in the living room with the lights dimmed, staring into the yard through the glass. The swing moved in its familiar rhythm, patient and endless. Occasionally, the seat jerked as though resisting something, then continued swaying. She wrapped a blanket tighter around her shoulders, her skin prickling with the sense that the swing was not merely moving, but watching. Michael dismissed her fears again. "It's an old frame," he explained. "Rust, loosened chains, drafts we don't feel." Yet even he grew uneasy when, after midnight, they both heard what sounded like faint laughter. It wasn't the laughter of a child in play, but something distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. The sound dissolved quickly into silence, but it left an aftertaste of dread in their minds. Laura pressed her ear against the wall that faced the yard. The sound was gone, replaced only by the throb of her heartbeat. When she drew back, Michael avoided her gaze. For once, he had no explanation. Over the next few days, other small oddities began to emerge. Laura found toys scattered across the garden, a ball, a doll's shoe, a piece of chalk, though they owned none of them. Daniel insisted they weren't his. Michael claimed the neighbor's children might have tossed them over the fence. Yet when Laura asked Evelyn Carter about it, the old woman shook her head. "No children here," she whispered, and her eyes hardened with something like fear. One evening, as the wind howled faintly through the trees, Laura caught sight of footprints in the soft soil near the swing. They were small, child-sized, and yet Daniel had been indoors the entire time. The footprints circled the swing and then vanished, as if swallowed by the ground itself. She called Michael, but when he returned with a flashlight, the prints had faded, as though the soil had never been touched. The house itself seemed to absorb their unease. Shadows clung longer in the hallways, and certain corners carried a chill that lingered even when the heater was on. Daniel became quieter, his once cheerful chatter replaced with long silences. He often asked if he could sleep with the window open, insisting he liked the night voices. Laura forbade it, but she caught him once, the curtains drawn back, his face bathed in moonlight as he stared out toward the swing. It was then she realized something dreadful. Daniel was no longer afraid of the sound of laughter outside. He was waiting for it. The first week in the new house closed with a night heavy with clouds, the moon smothered, the air pressing thick and cold against the windows. The Johnson family gathered in the living room, attempting normalcy. Michael read the news on his tablet. Laura pretended to focus on a book, and Daniel sketched shapes on a notepad, though his eyes often drifted toward the darkened backyard. The swing moved outside. Laura could hear it, faint but unmistakable, the steady scrape of rusted chains slicing the silence. She rose abruptly, unable to endure another night of pretending it wasn't happening. Pulling her coat tighter, she stepped out onto the porch. The garden was draped in shadow, the swing a silhouette against the pale glimmer of the streetlight beyond the fence. It swayed gently, patient as ever, as though mocking her. She approached, each step muffled by the damp earth, her breath shallow. The closer she came, the colder the air grew, until her skin prickled with a chill that felt alive. She reached out. Her hand trembled as her fingers brushed the wooden seat. It was ice cold, too cold for an object that had basked under the day's sun. She pressed it still, forcing the swing to halt. For a heartbeat, the yard seemed to exhale, silence deeper than silence itself, pressing on her ears. Then the chains shuddered. The seat jerked from her grasp, swinging forward on its own. Laura stumbled back, her heart slamming against her ribs. The swing arced higher, the chains screaming under strain, until it moved with the force of invisible legs pumping it from some unseen world. From the house, Daniel's voice called out faintly, but it was wrong. He was still inside, yet she heard him outside, right beside her, a perfect echo. She spun, finding nothing but shadows, the swing thrashing as if unseen hands clung to it. Michael burst through the back door with a flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, everything stopped. The swing slowed to a gentle sway, harmless once again. Laura stood frozen, her hand clutched against her chest. Michael looked at her with alarm, but said nothing. His eyes betrayed what his voice refused. He had seen it too. That night, neither of them slept. The house seemed to pulse with unease, its silence broken only by the occasional creak of wood and the distant groan of the chains. Daniel slept soundly, though, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Laura rose at dawn, the air damp with mist. She looked out into the yard one last time, desperate for reassurance. The swing was still, the garden bathed in gray light. Relief touched her briefly. Then she saw it, fresh footprints in the soil, small and barefoot, circling the swing again and again. They stopped at the back steps, as though something had climbed toward the house, and when she turned, her breath faltered. A wet patch of soil trailed across the living room floor, leading up the stairs toward Daniel's room. The swing was no longer outside. It was inside with them. The wet trail across the living room floor glistened faintly under the weak morning light, a thin gloss that darkened the wood and drew a broken path toward the stairs. Laura stood at the base of the steps, feeling the chill that always preceded recognition. the mind catching up to what the body already knew. The scent of damp soil rose from the boards, earthy and cold, like a garden turned inside out. Michael followed the marks slowly, careful not to smear them, counting each print in an attempt to assert control. The impressions were imprecise, soft-edged, as if made by small feet that did not fully commit to the world. They climbed the stairs in a cadence that suggested patience rather than panic, the kind of deliberate ascent belonging to someone who knew where to go. At the landing, the trail narrowed into smudges along the wall, faint strokes that reached at intervals toward the banister, as though a hand had steadied itself there. Daniel's door stood half-closed, and from within drifted the stale breath of a room slept in too deeply. The prints thinned into streaks that ended at the threshold, then vanished across the carpet as if absorbed by its fibers. Inside, the room was still. Daniel lay turned to one side, hair feathered across his pillow, his breathing slow and even. Laura paused long enough to watch the rise and fall of his shoulders and counted to 10 with the rhythm, a reflex she had built since he was born. The sound of the house pressed around her, the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, a lazily ticking clock, the conspicuous absence of any wind. Something else had changed. The air near the window felt colder, and the curtain lifted by an undetectable motion that was not a breeze. On the sill, grains of soil formed a thin crescent, as though a damp object had rested there. The pattern repeated lower, just above the floor, in 2 parallel bands, the exact width between the swing's chains. For a second, the mind insisted on coincidence. Then the metal scent brushed the tongue, that trace of oxidized iron that never belonged in a child's room, and denial retreated. Michael crouched near the bed frame and found a shallow groove in the wood, a clean line where something had pressed and rocked, pressing again, patient as breath. The image settled with clarity, the swing moving where it did not belong, translating its outside rhythm into the private interior, replacing night air with a different kind of night. They cleaned in silence. Towels absorbed the soil. The window was latched, the floor wiped until it reflected the pale morning. The ritual felt like sweeping away footprints at a crime scene no one would acknowledge. By the time Daniel stirred, the room had returned to its ordinary arrangement, though the cold remained threaded through the fabric of the space. The day unfolded with the clatter of tasks that pretended to be normal. Boxes were emptied and broken down. Kitchen drawers found their contents, yet the house did not reward their effort with warmth. Light moved across walls without softening, and the upstairs hallway kept a seam of shadow that did not change with the hour. Each time Laura descended the stairs, the image of the swing at the window rose unbidden, its seat hovering where it had no right to be, its chains imprinting faintly against paint and wood like fingerprints that could only be seen at an angle. Daniel drifted toward the yard in the afternoon and stood facing the swing without touching it. The seat swayed as though acknowledging him, a slow arc that felt communicative. He remained there so long that the sunlight leaned and cooled around him, and the sky took on that washed-out tone that belongs to the hour before the first porch lights come on. Michael called him inside with a voice that tried to be casual, and the boy obeyed without comment, though his eyes returned to the yard again and again, attentive to a quiet rhythm in which the rest of the world did not participate. In the evening, a new sound announced itself. It was not the familiar creak of chains, nor the intermittent tick of settling boards. It was a thinner noise, a thread of metal gently contacting metal, a tap that repeated in a pattern slow enough to notice and too regular to be ignored. It came from nowhere that could be named, and everywhere the listener stood, cocked heads, held breath, and then the melody of it established itself, a measured touch, like a pendulum asking a question. Laura paused in the hallway, and focused on the baseboards where shadow collected. The tap answered her stillness and then withheld, waiting for her to move. When she stepped forward, the sound resumed from behind, then from above, relocating with each shift as if encircling the listener, rather than occupying a fixed position. The house was learning their attention and testing what it could do with it. They slept, because bodies demand it. Sleep offered only shallow relief. In the small hours, Laura surfaced to the impression of motion in the room, the kind that registers at the edge of vision and behind the eyelids. She kept them closed, as if refusal had power. The mattress had a faint sway to it, a suggestion rather than a fact, a memory of the yard translated into fabric and springs. She counted slowly again, not to 10 but to 100, and when she opened her eyes, the room was still. Her breath formed a cloud against the cold and dissolved. Somewhere below, the tap resumed and ceased, like a metronome, marking the distance between the person listening and the presence listening back. Morning came with a flat light and a silence that felt bruised. The yard waited. The swing moved. The day accepted it all as a given. By the second week, the house had begun to carry the rhythm of the swing like a second heartbeat. Even when the chains outside were silent, the cadence echoed in their minds. The family spoke less, as though words might invite the sound back. Silence thickened the rooms, and within that silence, small intrusions multiplied. Laura began noticing odors that drifted without source, the sharp tang of rust, the sweetness of damp earth, the faint musk of decaying wood. They appeared at random, in the kitchen 1 hour and Daniel's room the next, disappearing before she could trace them. Each scent seemed connected to the yard, fragments of an outdoor presence that had slipped through the walls. Michael's denial frayed at the edges. He came home late from work, spending longer hours at the office, and when he entered the house, his eyes swept quickly to the windows before he set down his briefcase. His exhaustion made him careless, but even in weariness, he locked every door twice. The habit grew nightly, his way of staging control against something that could not be held out with bolts or keys. Daniel, by contrast, grew more withdrawn, yet more attuned. He no longer played with toys or asked to watch television. Instead, he sat by his window at night, staring into the dark yard where the swing traced its patient arcs. Sometimes Laura found sketches scattered across his desk, drawings of the swing rendered in crude pencil lines, each picture darker than the last, as though he pressed harder with every attempt. The final images showed not just the swing, but faint outlines beside it, smudges shaped like children who had no faces. Mrs. Evelyn Carter remained watchful across the street. Laura caught her more than once standing at her own window. Her curtains parted just enough to see the Johnson house. One afternoon, Laura approached her again, desperate for some acknowledgement. Evelyn's eyes softened with pity, but her voice stayed guarded. "It has always been there," she murmured, nodding toward the yard. "It doesn't leave. It waits. That's all it does. It waits." And before Laura could press further, Evelyn retreated, shutting her door firmly, leaving only the weight of her words. The nights grew sharper, shadows lingered longer, and sound behaved unnaturally, carrying from corners that had no mouths. Sometimes, while washing dishes, Laura heard the faint squeak of chains directly behind her, only to turn and find the kitchen empty. Other times, Michael swore he heard footsteps pacing across the attic, steady and small, though the attic had no flooring strong enough to hold weight. It was Daniel, though, who became the true barometer. His pallor lightened, his voice softened, and he began speaking in fragments Laura could not understand. She once found him on the porch at dawn, whispering into the fog, as though in answer to something unseen. When she touched his shoulder, he startled but did not explain, only returning to bed with the serenity of someone who had completed a ritual. The climax of this slow corruption arrived on a night of windless calm. The swing moved in its usual rhythm, but this time the sound of laughter threaded clearly through the house. It was unmistakable now, high and shrill, bending with distortion as though carried through an old radio. The sound circled the rooms, rising from vents, slipping through door frames, building until the walls themselves seemed to pulse with it. Laura and Michael rushed to Daniel's room, only to find him absent. The window stood open, curtains fluttering inward, though the air was still. His bed was undisturbed, as though he had never lain in it. Panic constricted Laura's chest as they ran downstairs, calling his name into silence. The back door hung ajar. Beyond it, the yard stretched gray under moonlight. The swing rocked violently, chains straining, and for the first time, there were shapes around it, indistinct, child-sized, blurred like figures caught in the periphery of vision. Their outlines flickered, too quick to fix, but their presence radiated unmistakably. And there, at the center of the circling motion, Daniel sat calmly on the swing, his small hands gripping the chains as though they had been waiting for him all along. Laura moved first, cutting across the damp grass with that careful speed, reserved for moments when stillness feels like surrender. The air around the swing had the wrong temperature, a cellar chill pressed into an open yard that at Daniel's feet skimmed the ground with each forward arc, toes grazing soil that refused to hold prints. The shapes circling him behaved like smudges on the eye rather than bodies in space, thinning when looked at directly, thickening at the periphery, assembling and dispersing with a logic that belonged to the swing alone. Michael skirted the other side, angling to reach the frame. The metal posts were colder than the air and left a sting in the palm, as though pulled from deep water. The swing's path shifted under his approach, abandoning the predictable back and forth for a slow ellipse, the kind of orbit that draws everything near without ever letting it touch. Chain links clicked with a delicate regularity, metal brushing metal in a near-melodic pattern that had already begun to infiltrate the house at night. Laura focused on Daniel's hands. Small fingers gripped the chains lightly, not the white-knuckled hold of fear or play, but the relaxed contact of a sleeper. The seat moved him. He did not move it. Each pass forward lifted the edges of his shirt and pulled a ribbon of cold across his ribs. Each return brushed a curtain of fog from his face. His eyes stayed half-lidded, not closed, not fully awake, fixed on a middle distance that had nothing to do with the fence, the porch, or the tree line. The laughter changed. What had once sounded like a lone, distorted recording now layered itself into harmonics. Thin voices stacked imperfectly, overlapping at fractions of a second, so that they never aligned. The effect was strangely orderly. It did not announce malice. It announced repetition. The yard had become a room whose only furniture was a motion that could not end. A chalk line cut the soil near the swing's arc, pale and powdery, as if laid down minutes before. It formed a rectangle with numbers ghosted at the corners, a pattern recognizable from playgrounds, scaled smaller than the one from memory. Beside it, the lonely ball Laura had found days earlier, arrested against the fence, positioned as though placed, rather than thrown. None of these objects belonged to the Johnson family. All of them obeyed the logic of play. The wrongness did not come from violence. It came from insistence. Michael reached the seat on a backward pass and pressed down, attempting to rob it of momentum. The swing yielded under his weight for a heartbeat, then reclaimed its rhythm with a force that surprised him. The chains sang through the frame, a vibration that traveled into the earth. The next pass brushed his knee with a deliberate nudge, as if correcting interference. He stepped aside, heat flushing through the cold as his body insisted on an explanation that did not arrive. Laura extended both arms and braced the swing at the end of an arc. The wood met her hands like ice glass. For an instant the motion paused, suspended in a hush so complete that even the streetlight buzz seemed to dim. Then the seat continued, not violently, not even rudely, simply refusing the condition of rest. A breath later, Daniel blinked and swayed with it again, pliant as a pendulum's bob. Time misbehaved. Minutes stretched and compressed while the sky rearranged its gray. Clouds thinned to reveal a coin of moon, then gathered again, and in the shifting light, the shapes thickened. One stood nearest the frame and raised something that could have been an arm. Another hung back near the chalk rectangle, indistinct head tilted toward the numbers as if appraising rules. A third stood behind the seat and tracked its passage with the patience of a metronome. None of them resolved into faces. They did not blink. They did not step. They occupied positions the way a thought occupies a mind. The house watched through its windows. Curtains breathed inward, despite closed panes. A hallway light clicked on without a switch being touched, then dimmed to the weak amber of a night lamp in an unfamiliar room. Inside that light, dust moved like underwater snow, and for a moment Laura understood the yard and the hallway as the same place stretched into different shapes. When it ended without theatrics. The swing slowed in increments too small to mark. Daniel's grip loosened to the natural slackness of waking fingers. The shapes thinned, then flattened into the surrounding dark like stains drying. The laughter released its last distorted ribbon and was done. The garden accepted the return of ordinary silence without apology. Daniel stepped from the seat on his own and walked back toward the porch with the calm of someone who had followed instructions. Mud clung to the edges of his socks, and a smear of pale dust marked one knee where it had grazed the chalk. He passed between his parents without looking up and crossed the threshold as if obeying a bell none of the others could hear. They entered after him and shut the door. The lock rotated with a mechanical certainty that felt performative. The room did not warm. The air still smelled faintly of iron. The metronome sound ceased but left behind an imprint. The body continued to register. In the kitchen, the drawer with old keys rattled once and settled. On the stairs, a step bowed under weight that had not climbed it. In Daniel's room, the crescent of soil on the sill reappeared, as precise as a signature. Morning carried the garden indoors again. On the dining table, a ring of damp earth formed around the base of a water glass. On the refrigerator door, a magnet slipped several inches and rested at a slant, pointing toward the yard. In the laundry room, a pair of shoelaces tangled themselves into a knot with a loop that suggested a bow but refused to tighten or release. None of it broadcast menace. All of it declared presence. Michael called Richard Lee during lunch from the office parking lot and left a measured message that did not use the words he wanted to use. In the late afternoon, Richard arrived with a leather folder and the expression of a man who preferred transactions to stories. He stood just inside the doorway, scanned the rooms as though mapping exits, and kept his shoes on despite the clean floors. Papers emerged. Warranties stacked on inspections, inspection notes stacked on disclaimers. At the bottom sat a thin envelope, dated years earlier with a municipal seal. The letter referenced equipment removal and cited a failure to meet safety standards for playground structures on private property. The notice ended with the phrase, "Work incomplete." Richard's gaze drifted to the backyard and then quickly away. His hands straightened the stack that did not need straightening. The visit concluded with handshakes performed out of habit rather than trust. The envelope remained on the table, unclaimed, as though it preferred the house that kept it. After sunset, the chalk pattern outside had multiplied. The rectangle now had companions. A circle bisected by a line, a ladder of boxes, two arcs that intersected and created a lens shape at the meeting point. The grass within those shapes lay flatter than the rest, pressed by feet that weighed no more than the memory of feet. The swing resumed its pulse, as though the day had been a pause rather than a reprieve. Daniel placed an object on his windowsill before bed. The doll's single shoe found days ago, cleaned carefully with a damp cloth and set toe out like a keepsake. On the glass, breath drew a fog that lingered longer than breath should. In that fog, two small ovals formed beside his reflection, as if another face had exhaled next to his and pressed close to see what he was seeing. The ovals faded when he blinked, but not quickly. The room held the outline long enough for the mind to adjust to it. Downstairs, Laura gathered the papers and slid the municipal letter into a drawer. The metal runner scraped in a way that echoed chain against chain. The sound stitched the house to the yard, and the yard to the house again, and the night accepted the seam without comment. Morning thinned the night into a gray wash that left edges softer and sounds nearer. A small parcel waited on the porch, wrapped in paper that had absorbed the previous night's dew. Inside lay a single photograph, a square with the warm gloss of a Polaroid, its white border stained at one corner as if thumbed too often. The image captured the yard decades earlier. The same frame, the same seat, the grass shorter, the fence straighter, the house whiter. The swing arced mid-motion, the chain blurred into a faint silver smear. In the window behind it, a dark interior watched back, not with faces, but with the density of shadow. Under the photograph, a handwritten date had feathered into illegibility. The picture seemed to exhale old air. It smelled of plastic and attic dust, and the metallic breath of orphaned batteries. The photograph altered the day without announcing it. Everywhere Laura walked, the house offered small corrections to memory. A new scuff appeared on the baseboard, at the exact height of a swinging seat. A faint ring marked the ceiling above the foyer light. A halo of dust loosened in a circle the size of a tire. On the stair landing, powdery residue traced a diagonal crease where a chain might have brushed. Nothing had weight, yet everything had left a mark. The house had begun to memorize an object that did not belong inside it. Outside, the chalk geometry expanded again. The rectangle deepened, lines multiplied, and the ladder of boxes reached from the swing's path toward the porch steps, like a measured invitation. The shapes used the yard as paper, and the grass as eraser. Where a line ended, the blades bent in agreement. The air stayed strangely still, yet the garden carried the low whisper of friction, the faint rasp of something traveling through grit. By afternoon, silence pressed in with the weight of a closed library. The thermostat displayed a number the body refused to believe. Every room held a different cold. In the kitchen, the chill felt damp. In the hallway, it felt dry. And in Daniel's room, it moved like a current. The refrigerator hummed at a pitch that matched the chain's quiet song. The television, off and unplugged, reflected a wash of light that pulsed as if a scene were playing in grayscale under the surface. Michael's folders remained open on the dining table. The municipal letter centered like a verdict. The phrase "work incomplete" drew the eye each time the page was passed. The implication grew obvious. The frame in the yard had once been one element in a larger set. Other structures had been removed. The swing remained. Removal had been interrupted. The yard, faithful to its old purpose, had continued the game without participants. The house, now in partnership, had begun adapting the rules indoors. Evening thinned into night without a moment that could be named. Lamps flickered, not in warning but in negotiation, compromising on a dimness that left corners intact. The scent of damp soil returned, layered now with a sweet note of chalk. In the upstairs bathroom, Condensation formed on a mirror, though no hot water had run. A breathy veil that refused to clear. When Laura wiped it with a towel, the cloth came away clean, but the fog bled back at once, as if the glass exhaled from within. The first sound arrived like a misremembered word. A light tap on the hallway wall found a cadence and repeated. It was not footsteps. It was not wind. It was the contact of metal on paint in a sequence that measured time without counting it. The tap traveled 6 inches at a time, paused, then advanced again, mapping the wall as if it were a floor. Dust lifted and settled in soft puffs that caught the lamplight like pale pollen. In Daniel's room, the windowsill displayed its crescent of soil with renewed precision. The small shoe he had placed there sat toe out, pristine, an anchor for attention. Across the room, on the floor near the bed, a faint ladder of boxes appeared in graphite gray, not drawn but pressed into the fibers by force, distributed over a thin edge. When Laura turned her head, the boxes were gone. When she returned her gaze, they were back, slightly shifted, as if the pattern were being rehearsed rather than displayed. The house declared its intent more clearly in the next hour. On the living room rug, the nap flattened outward in a circle, a track polished by a motion that did not touch it. On the ceiling above, the halo darkened, and from its center a tiny swirl of dust fell in slow motion, spiraling like ash. The front door settled in its frame, wood answering wood with a low complaint. The clock in the hallway paused and resumed with the stutter of a breath, held too long. They moved through the rooms as if obeying instructions. Michael traced the baseboard scuffs with a finger that came away cold. Laura stood in the threshold of Daniel's room and watched his sleeping face for the small signs that separate sleep from imitation. Daniel breathed steadily, but the rhythm of his breaths matched the rhythm of the chain outside, an alignment that made the mind rebel. There was no wind. The swing still moved. The moment of translation arrived past midnight, announced not by sound, but by stillness. The yard quieted. The chains held their breath. The photograph on the mantel cracked by a hairline, a fracture so fine it would take morning to see. In the upstairs hallway, the air thickened and cooled until it felt like the shade under a metal roof in noon heat. A pale smear appeared on the wall at knee height, then darkened, then divided into 2 parallel bands the width of the chain links. The bands moved together in a slow arc that raised the fine hairs on skin. The wall remembered being air, and the air remembered being outside. Daniel rose from bed with the smooth inevitability of a pendulum passing center. His feet found the floor without sound. He stepped into the hallway and placed 1 foot into an invisible square, then another, and then another. Each placement measured, each pause aligning with the motion of the absent seat. The ladder of boxes revealed itself with each step, as if his weight developed it. The final square hovered over the top stair like a space that could not exist. Laura reached for him and found the air colder near his shoulder than near his hand, as if he were only partially available to touch. Michael stood a pace behind, body angled to block, but the hallway had changed its length and would not obey placement. Sound condensed into a single metallic thread that seemed to descend from the dark above and attach to the crown of the boy's head, like a string on a paper kite. The ceiling halo shed another spiral of dust. The house completed the memory it had been rehearsing. From the foyer below came a slow groan, not from hinges, but from weight accepting a mount. The circle on the ceiling deepened to a faint indentation. A second circle formed 3 feet away, then a third, measuring a frame. The hallway light dimmed to the color of old lemon, and a small gust of cold rolled down the stairs without any window opening to allow it. The front door unlatched itself in 2 mechanical clicks and drifted inward by an inch, admitting night-like water through a crack in a glass. Upstairs, the air tightened with the smell of iron and wet wood. The bands on the wall curved downward in a path a seated body would take. Daniel's foot hovered over the last square. The hush of the house felt absolute, the kind of silence that exists underwater when the surface is far away. The ceiling indentation reached its limit and held. A shadow cut itself from the dark and took the shape of a horizontal plank suspended at waist height, a suggestion of a seat mapped in absence rather than in matter. The parallel bands stopped beside it and shivered. Daniel's weight shifted forward, attentive to emotion only he could feel. The house waited to decide whether the next inch existed. The front door finished its drift. The night inside matched the night outside with perfect pressure. The frame the ceiling remembered found its balance. A second swing began to move inside the hallway. The second swing announced itself without sound, yet its presence thickened the air until every breath carried a metallic aftertaste. Laura froze at the sight of it, not a material object, but a suggestion rendered by shadow and motion. The arc traced itself in empty space, perfectly aligned with the rhythm outside, as though the yard had replicated its pulse within the house. Daniel's foot hovered above the last square in the invisible ladder, his body suspended between forward motion and the weight of stillness. The hallway no longer resembled the domestic corridor of painted walls and carpet runner. Its dimensions stretched subtly, the ceiling higher, the walls slightly bowed, the floor a surface that reflected none of their weight. It felt like standing inside the throat of a memory that refused to release them. Michael reached first, but his hand slipped through the blurred outline of the seat as if grasping water. The air where the swing moved was colder by degrees, a pocket of atmosphere stolen from the night outside. His skin numbed instantly, pins and needles racing up his wrist. He pulled back, startled less by the pain than by the realization that the motion had noticed him. The arc adjusted minutely, acknowledging interference. Laura braced herself against the wall. Her palm pressed into the paint, but the wall carried the faint vibration of chain links, as though the entire structure resonated with a rhythm too deep to silence. The sound was not audible, yet it moved her bones, a subtle tremor that reminded her of standing too close to passing trains. The house had ceased being passive shelter. It had become part of the mechanism. Daniel stepped forward at last. His foot found the invisible square, and the second swing accepted him with a precision that defied doubt. His body tilted, settled, and then rocked back in tandem with the unseen arc. His eyes fluttered closed. The seat held him with the assurance of something practiced, as though the hallway had been built for this purpose long before walls and ceilings were added. The motion grew stronger. The plaster above groaned faintly, and dust sifted down in slow spirals. From the foyer below, the indentation of the ceiling deepened, shadow cutting itself into the suggestion of a second frame. The front door stood wider now, open enough to allow the night breeze to mingle with the stale cold of the house. The division between outside and inside collapsed further with each sway. The photograph discovered on the porch shifted on the mantel, sliding a fraction of an inch without assistance. Its image blurred in the dim light until the swing in the picture no longer looked solitary. A faint double arc traced across the Polaroid, twin smears where there had been one, aligning with the rhythm now shaking the walls. Laura's breath came shallow and fast. She tried to call Daniel's name, but the sound died in her throat. The silence of the hallway absorbed words before they could leave her mouth, pressing them flat against her teeth. Only the chains spoke, their unseen contact threading through the walls, floor, and air. Michael attempted force. He lunged forward and wrapped both arms around Daniel's torso, intent on lifting him from the phantom seat. For a second, it worked. The boy's body shifted, weight returning to the human scale. But then the swing resisted, not violently, not with a jerk, but with the insistence of gravity itself. Michael's grip failed against the simple inevitability of rhythm, and Daniel fell back into the arc as though magnetized. The motion accelerated, The second swing moved faster than the first, dragging its passenger deeper into cadence. Shadows lengthened, distorted, then coalesced around the ceiling indentation until a frame of pure absence hung suspended overhead. The chains were no longer suggestions, but darker lines against the dim, vibrating faintly like cords stretched too tight. The laughter returned, layered and broken, spilling down the stairwell in a cascade that bent the ear and churned the stomach. It was not loud, but it filled every chamber of the body, a resonance that bypassed hearing and settled into marrow. The sound formed no words, yet carried intent, play, repetition, return. Laura's vision blurred. For a second she saw not the hallway, but a playground bathed in night. Swings multiplied into rows, each seat occupied by indistinct figures that moved in perfect unison. Their shadows reached far, tangling into each other, weaving a net of motion that spanned farther than the eye could follow. When she blinked, the house returned, but the impression remained burned into her mind like an after-image. Michael staggered back, chest heaving. His knuckles bled where he had struck the wall in desperation, but the wound felt distant, as though the house had absorbed part of his pain. Daniel swayed higher, his head tilted back, lips parted in silent laughter that did not belong to him. The chains sang louder, and dust rained steadily now, covering the carpet in pale grit. The house no longer waited, it demanded, and the second swing, born inside its walls, had only just begun its game. Morning rearranged the house back into rooms and stairs and doors, but the impression of the second swing did not lift. The hallway carried a faint groove where nothing should have touched it, a shallow track that caught dust and light in a way that made the eye stumble. Laura traced the mark once with the side of her hand and felt the chill that always accompanied contact with the invisible. The air there tasted of iron again, as if a thin fog of rust sat just above the paint. Michael took the day as invitation to act. Tools came out of a carton, a wrench cold enough to bite, a can of lubricant that smelled industrial and certain. Outside, the frame waited with the stubborn calm of an old structure. He knelt at the base and found bolts fused to their plates by time and weather. The first attempt yielded nothing. The second turned the nut a fraction, enough to creak a protest through the metal, then seized as if the threads had braided themselves overnight. A fine powder stained his fingers, gritty red-brown, the residue of years. The seat moved while he worked. It kept a courteous distance, a steady rhythm that refused to be a distraction and succeeded anyway. He angled a crowbar against the foot of the frame and levered upward. The yard answered with a low vibration that traveled through soil and into bone. The sound resembled footsteps underground, not marching but pacing, left, right, left, an old pattern rehearsing itself beneath the lawn. Michael lowered the tool without admitting defeat. The frame settled back with a click that felt deliberate. The game was not mechanical, and the yard preferred rules to force. Inside, Laura sorted paper like evidence. The municipal letter sat in the center again, its phrasework incomplete, continuing to insist on attention. She unfolded the envelope corners further and found an index card stuck to the inner flap, a hand-drawn map of the property lines in miniature. The yard cut into measured shapes with a pencil so faint it nearly vanished. At one edge, a penciled note marked the position of a second structure with a rectangle and a cross through it. The cross suggested removal. The rectangle remained. By midday, a cardboard box appeared on the porch without a knock. Laura lifted the lid and recognized the dull silver of old staples and the faint fragrance of attic dust. Inside lay neighborhood newsletters from decades ago, mimeographed pages that had bled ink at their edges. The issues documented summer barbecues, bake sales, and a short paragraph about a safety inspection that named no one and blamed nothing. The paragraph ended with a date followed by the word postponed. At the bottom of the stack lay another photograph, this one more formal, a yard captured in clean daylight. The swing sat at the center like furniture arranged after a move. In the window behind it, a smudge darker than shadow rested where a child's face should have been, if a child had been there. Laura returned the photograph to the box with care and did not look at the street to see who had left it. Across the way, Mrs. Evelyn Carter stood half hidden behind her curtain, posture rigid, eyes fixed on the Johnson house with the discipline of someone who had learned not to blink. Daniel moved through the afternoon as if reading from an invisible schedule. He ate without comment and stood by the back door at the same time he had stood there the day before. His feet found the first 2 porch boards that creaked and avoided them on return, as though observing courtesy toward sleeping wood. In his room, the sketches multiplied. The early drawings had been crude figures and a seat. The new pages diagrammed angles, arcs, and counts. The mathematics of swing motion rendered in heavy pencil with eraser smears like fog. The last page showed the upstairs hallway, drawn from memory. A faint line traced an arc across the ceiling, where the indented halo had begun to darken, and beside it, a second arc, closer to the wall, both annotated by small numbers that repeated every other line. The numbers matched the rhythm of the chains. Laura opened the attic hatch with a care that felt ceremonial. Dust lifted in a slow cloud, and the temperature dropped several degrees within the first rung of the ladder. The attic floor was not complete, only planks laid across joists. In the center, a square of plywood had been placed long ago, with more intention than the rest. On that square, 2 shallow ruts ran parallel, punctuated by dimples the size of chain links. The pattern carried the memory of weight, without the stain of impact, as if no material had ever touched it, and yet had left a record of itself. A soft whisper rose when she leaned closer. Not a voice, more the sound of fine grit sliding along wood in a rhythm that matched the yard. She closed the hatch with a small effort and stood beneath it until her breath slowed. Evening brought the familiar compromise of dim light and long shadow. The exterior swing resumed its pulse, and the interior answered less brazenly, a suggestion of arc that nudged the hallway without fully revealing itself. The house began accommodating the pattern with small architectural courtesies. A picture frame on the stair wall tilted to follow the curve. The runner gathered a shallow wrinkle that matched the path. In the kitchen, a cabinet door refused to close the last inch, as if holding a place for a chain to pass through. None of it felt like haunting. It felt like renovation toward an older plan, an abandoned blueprint, reasserting primacy. Richard Lee sent what he preferred, instead of presents. A scanned packet arrived by email, its pages photographed in low resolution late at night. The packet contained a contractor estimate for removal of play structures on private lots in a small cluster of streets, stamped received and misfiled. The notes cited corrosion, liability, and neighbor complaints about noise at hours when no one's children were outside. The handwriting in the margin belonged to someone impatient. The words across phases 1 and 2 had been crossed out, with a line so hard it tore the paper fibers. Farther down, a name appeared that Laura did not recognize, followed by a check mark and a date missing its year. The packet added no answers, only the sense that the yard had once been part of something coordinated that had ended without concluding. Wind stayed absent, but the night moved. In the upstairs hall, dust described gentle ellipses that overlapped in patient layers, the visible trace of an unseen pendulum. A smell of damp earth rose through the floorboards, as if the lawn had been inverted overhead. The house listened. The family listened back. The silence between each chain contact felt like a question. It was not a Maldi's Son shouted, It was the polite insistence of a game that refused to admit it was over. Near midnight, the chalk marks outside brightened in the moon's wash. The rectangle at the swing's path had worn a shallow trench through grass to soil. New shapes extended toward the side gate in a sequence that resembled migration, each box stepping toward a boundary as though the yard itself had tired of its perimeter. The second arc inside lengthened by an inch the moment the porch light clicked off. A whisper rose in the vents, more breath than word, a soft hiss that synchronized with Daniel's breathing, until the room and the boy shared one pace. Laura watched the dark for a long time and understood that rules remained in effect. The removal had failed. The play continued. The house had remembered how to count. The next day settled into silence, so dense it pressed like fabric against the ears. No birds crossed the yard. No insects buzzed near the porch lamp. Even the road beyond the fence withheld its usual interruptions. Laura walked through the house with the sensation of trespass, every floorboard registering her steps, as though the house were archiving weight for comparison later. Daniel remained quiet but purposeful. He arranged his drawings on the floor in a sequence that resembled instructions. Each sheet showed a fragment of structure: arcs, ladders, rectangles, circles. Aligned side by side, they formed a corridor that stretched from the swing outside to the hallway upstairs. The lines overlapped like transparencies, and the order seemed less creative than remembered, as though he had been tasked with reproducing something pre-existing. The pencil marks grew heavier toward the final sheets, grooves pressed into paper that tore at the edges from insistence. Michael attempted reason with wood and steel again, but the frame defied him. He brought a saw this time, its blade sharp and sure, its teeth catching morning light. The first stroke bit into metal with a scream that startled even him, and then the teeth dulled as though biting stone. Sparks leapt once, then stopped, leaving the blade glazed with residue that looked like iron dust, but smelled of burned leaves. He dropped the saw and left it standing in the soil, the tool vibrating faintly until it quieted on its own. The seat continued its rhythm, patient and undisturbed. The house shifted in response. Upstairs, the plaster ceiling above Daniel's room shed a fine thread of powder along a hairline crack. In the hallway, the indentation darkened, sharpening into the outline of a rectangle mirrored to the one outside. The air tasted metallic, not sharp but constant, the way coins taste when held too long in the mouth. Laura wiped the sill again, but the soil returned in the next breath, grains arranged into a crescent so precise it resembled deliberate handwriting. Afternoon shadows lengthened and gathered in corners. One corner of the living room deepened until it seemed to retreat an inch farther back than the others, space folding in a way that defied measure. The clock on the mantel hiccuped again, its second hand pausing at intervals, then leaping forward with nervous energy. The photograph shifted a second time, sliding fully to the edge of the shelf before stopping as though restrained. By evening, the inside swing had grown bold. The arc traced longer, nearly touching the wall before reversing, its invisible mass displacing air with a faint draft. Curtains moved without windows opening. Dust swirled in elongated spirals instead of settling. Each pass pressed against lungs, a phantom pressure that made breathing shallow. Daniel sat cross-legged on the carpet in the hallway, directly within the arc, and did not flinch when the invisible seat passed through him. His body swayed in synchronization, neither resisting nor acknowledging, simply moving with the rhythm like a participant chosen by routine. Laura reached for him, but her hand cooled as it neared, her skin prickling with the sensation of standing near an open freezer door. She withdrew quickly, the impression following her into her chest, as though the cold had attached itself to her ribs. Michael watched from the stairs, expression blank with exhaustion. His hands trembled at rest, and a shallow cut across his palm wept rust-colored fluid rather than bright red. He pressed a cloth to it, muttering no sound, and still the blood dried darker than it should. The house was altering more than wood and air. It was beginning to edit the body. Nightfall collapsed boundaries further. The outside swing's creak blended with the phantom chains indoors until no ear could separate the two. The yard's chalk shapes glowed faintly under moonlight, white lines pale as bones. From the upstairs window, the geometry extended farther than the property line, as though the street had accepted the pattern too, boxes stretching into shadow where pavement should have erased them. The neighborhood was not immune. The neighborhood was already implicated. Laura woke near midnight to a noise different from the familiar cadence. This sound was lower, more deliberate, a dragging scrape that began at the porch and moved up the stairs with the certainty of something carrying weight. Each step bowed, each riser groaned, though no figure appeared. The scrape ended at the hallway, where silence thickened again. She crept from the bedroom to find Daniel standing. His eyes remained closed, but his head tilted upward toward the ceiling crack, where dust fell in a thin thread. The invisible seat swung directly through him, its arc more defined than ever, the air now bending visibly like heat above asphalt. The chains existed as darker lines, not solid, yet not entirely absent, vibrating with a tension that spread into the walls. Michael emerged behind her, and together they watched as the second swing gained velocity. Each pass pushed air into their chests, stealing breath. The hallway stretched again, longer than it had been minutes before, the end vanishing into dimness, though no bulb had failed. At that depth of shadow, faint shapes swayed in unison, smaller bodies rocking in time, rows upon rows, extending farther than architecture allowed. The corridor was no longer theirs. It had lengthened into something older. Daniel's lips parted in the beginning of a smile that was not his. His body tilted back with the swing, eyes rolling under lids, chest rising in rhythm, not with lungs, but with chains. The air tightened with expectation. The hallway waited for the next step, the next repetition, the next proof that the game was still in progress. And then the crack in the ceiling split with a sharp report, plaster falling in a line across the carpet, exposing the dark void of the attic above. The sound echoed like a starter's whistle, a signal that play was not paused but begun again. The crack across the ceiling widened with a soft tear that sounded like fabric pulled in slow motion. Plaster dust drifted in a pale curtain, and behind it, the attic revealed its dark mouth, a rectangle of absence edged by splinters where the paint had sheared. Cold fell through the opening in a steady sheet, the kind of cold that does not refresh but erases. Beneath it, the second swing kept its silent arc, pressing and returning, as if the house were metering time in a unit older than seconds. Laura stepped back until her shoulders met the hallway wall, then realized the paint there carried the faint vibration of chain links again, a thrum that climbed bone and settled behind the eyes. The corridor felt mismeasured now. Distance shifted with each breath. The runner stretched by an inch that should not exist. At the edges of vision, the corners lost their right angles, trading them for softer curves that suggested a circle inside a rectangle, the geometry of playgrounds nested within domestic plans. Daniel stood directly under the split plaster, his face upturned, his eyelashes glittering with dust like frost. He did not flinch when a larger fragment fell and landed beside his heel with a brittle clack. His breathing synchronized with the motion in the air, a rise and fall that matched the invisible seat's weightless push. Each time his chest lifted, the cold intensified by a degree, as if the house rewarded correct cadence. Michael moved with the momentum of refusal. He dragged a step-ladder from the linen closet, the aluminum scraping the baseboards with a hollow shout. When he set it beneath the opening, the ladder protested with a tremor that traveled into the floor. He climbed until his hair brushed the hanging dust, the air thinning with altitude, as if ascent had meaning, separate from the 5 rungs he had mounted. The attic smelled of dry wood and coin metal, and the sweetness of old chalk. At the edge of the opening, 2 shallow grooves cut across the joist, parallel and polished smooth by contact, that should not have occurred. Between them, small dimples repeated at even intervals, the exact size and spacing of chain links. Michael reached toward the darkness and felt temperature drop along his forearm in bands, as if he were passing through layers of night. Something brushed his skin that was not air, the delicate pressure of a passing loop. He withdrew, and the loop withdrew with him, a polite refusal that carried the weight of a rule. Below, the second swing altered its path. The arc lengthened toward the ladder and shortened away. Not an attack, but an invitation. The heartbeat of a game adjusting to make room for a new participant. Dust on the runner began to move in arcs that overlapped, faint crescents growing darker with repetition, until a braided pattern appeared, a double helix of motion mapped in powder. The house was not simply copying the yard, it was practicing. Outside, the yard accepted the rehearsal. The chalk marks brightened under moonlight that should not have reached them through the cloud cover. The rectangle at the swing's path deepened into a shallow trench. A ladder of boxes extended toward the side gate and then angled back as if reluctant to cross the property line. In the photograph on the mantel, the gloss flattened and the blurred swing smear doubled again, 2 silver arcs kissing at their peaks before separating. Across the street, Mrs. Evelyn Carter stepped onto her porch and stood still, both hands on the rail, her gaze steady on the Johnson house as if taking attendance. Richard Lee's car rolled to the curb without the courtesy of headlights. He remained inside, shoulders hunched, attention locked on the open front door and the wash of cold laking through it, visible in the way hedges bent and leaves trembled without wind. He lifted his phone, lowered it, lifted it again, and then set it face down on the passenger seat, his knuckles whitening around the steering wheel. The neighborhood had learned the sound by now. Even with engines off and televisions muted, the thin click of metal on metal threaded the block. Daniel's drawings lay arranged along the hallway baseboard, a paper trail that matched the house's memory. Laura saw a new page that had not been there an hour earlier, pencil lines so dark they had torn the surface. The page diagrammed an arc across the ceiling split, annotated by repeating numbers that matched the rhythm in her lungs. At the center of the arc, a small rectangle floated, suspended by 2 lines. The rectangle had no shading, no texture, only a border so heavily traced that it impressed itself into the wood beneath the paper. The drawing did not render a swing. It rendered the place where a swing insisted it would be. Michael climbed the last rung. The attic's dark, pressed close, textured by granular air. He felt it in his teeth. He reached again and found not metal, not wood, but the shape of a seat described by cold. The outline was too exact to be imagined. Where his palm expected emptiness, resistance met it, soft and unyielding at once, a physics that did not belong to mass. He pushed, and the seat moved with a courtesy that allowed a test, and then reclaimed the arc. Tension vibrated through his bones. A tuning fork struck in a key the body recognizes before the mind names it. The second swing below answered with acceleration. The runner lifted a millimeter from the floor and settled. The indentation on the foyer ceiling deepened until the plaster formed a shallow saucer. A second saucer formed beside it, and then a third, spaced at the exact width of the yard frame. The front door eased another inch on its hinges, admitting a stripe of night that sliced the hall floor like a ruler. The stripe carried the night's smell: wet wood, rust, distant soil. The stripe did not waver. Laura's attention snapped to sound that was not the chain's click. Footsteps rose from somewhere a floor below, small and even, the measured pace of a child returning indoors after play. The steps reached the first stair and ascended, each tread answering with a soft complaint. The footsteps did not belong to Daniel, who remained motionless beneath the breach. The steps reached the landing and then stopped at the precise point where the invisible arc crossed. Silence refilled the space like water. Michael set one knee on the top rung and leaned into the attic void. He could feel the swing now as a cold silhouette. He extended his other hand downward toward Daniel, and in the same instant the presence above extended itself toward him. A band of cold closed gently around his wrist. Not a grab, not a clamp, more the complete encirclement of temperature around a limb, like placing an arm into a ring of ice that had been molded to fit. The ring tightened with patience rather than force. The house committed. The second swing completed a longer pass and did not fully return, as though its path now required a destination that lay above rather than between walls. Dust fell in threads, so steady they resembled rain. The attic hatch edges darkened, as if polished by repeated touch. The corridor stretched another impossible inch towards the bedroom doors. On the porch, the parcel that had delivered the first photograph flipped on its side without hands, its empty interior angled toward the open door like a mouth hoping for an echo. Laura stepped forward, and the temperature gradient shifted. Her shin entered the colder band, nerves flaring with pins and needles, and she felt the ring of cold around Michael's wrist, as clearly as if it had closed around her own. The sensation carried texture, faint ridges spaced with precision, the impression of links without the presence of metal. The ring tightened another fraction, and Michael's weight altered on the ladder by a degree the eye could not see, but the floor sensed. The ladder answered with a small creak that sounded like a permission rather than a warning. Outside, the yard refused to be excluded. The swing arced higher than it had in weeks, the chains singing in a key. The house now matched. The chalk ladder brightened, boxes hazard white under the moon. The side gate drifted inward by a fingertip, admitting night that had learned to move like breath. Richard watched from the car and did not blink. Evelyn stepped down one stair, then another, stopping only when the cold reached her shoes. She did not cross the street. She did not turn away. She held the rail and waited for the next repetition. Inside, the attic answered the repetition with a new sound, a thin tap that snapped at regular intervals from somewhere deeper in the dark, the sound of a chain completing a small circle and kissing a hook. The ring on Michael's wrist tightened to matching tempo. Daniel's chest rose and fell in the same beat. Dust traced twin ellipses around their bodies and settled on nothing. The photograph on the mantel slid the last fraction and fell, face down, the clap of cardboard on wood performing the role of a whistle. The house had remembered the rule that ends practice and begins the game. Something else closed a cold, link-textured grip around Michael's wrist and pulled. The grip tightened with the patience of inevitability, not crushing but enclosing, a perfect mold of chain links rendered in temperature rather than steel. Michael's body lurched forward, weight dragged into the attic void with such precision it seemed less force than geometry correcting itself. The ladder shrieked against the wall, feet skidding on polished wood, but it did not topple. It held, as though the house itself had decided the balance must be preserved until the motion completed. Laura rushed forward, her hands catching his waist. The moment she touched him, the same cold closed around her wrists in echo, softer but present, an imprint that traveled through skin into bone. She pulled with desperation, but the resistance she met was not strength. It was inevitability, a rhythm insisting on its own completion. Every tug she made was returned with equal measure, like opposing swings tied by a single chain. Each motion answered with its mirror. Above, the attic deepened. What had been shadow now thickened into shape, not entirely seen but suggested by outlines that shifted with the falling dust. Two posts stood parallel in the gloom, their bases lost in the void, their tops lost in a height the roof should not have allowed. Between them stretched absence that quivered with potential, a frame reconstructed by memory rather than matter. The air vibrated in thin pulses, steady and exact, the kind of rhythm that cannot be broken because it was never learned but always known. Daniel's eyes opened at last, and for the first time his pupils carried not reflection but absorption. The black centers drank light, wider than natural, swallowing the dust sparkles that tried to settle on them. His lips moved in silence, each shape matching the slow arc of the swing's motion. He did not speak, but the cadence of his mouth matched the chains, as if sound could now bypass words entirely. Michael struggled, but his body responded like a pendulum reaching apex. For every inch he drew back, the grip yielded only to reclaim it with the return. The attic seat accepted his balance with invisible grace, aligning his movements until resistance no longer mattered. Sweat gathered on his brow, freezing as it formed, beads of ice rolling down his temple to shatter on the rung below. His breath steamed in clouds, though the room had no draft. Laura screamed without sound, the hallway's silence swallowing it whole. Her throat burned from the attempt, the effort of voicing into a space that had decided words were unnecessary. She pulled harder, muscles straining, the tendons in her arms trembling like cords under weight. The grip at her wrists tightened again, aligning her cadence with Michael's, dragging her into synchronization. Her heartbeat stuttered, then steadied into the same tempo as the swing. The front door downstairs opened fully with a hollow knock against the wall, a gesture of final invitation. Night air surged through the house, carrying the damp scent of soil and rust, the fragrance of old playgrounds and wet iron. Curtains lifted, though no breeze should have carried that far. The photographs that had shifted for days fell together at last, scattering across the mantel, some face up, some face down, each showing the same blur of arcs multiplied. Outside, the yard erupted in new lines. Chalk geometry stretched beyond the lawn, boxes intersecting in ladders that crossed pavement, climbed curbs, extended toward Evelyn's porch. She stepped backward as the white reached her feet, her lips pressed tight, but her body unwilling to retreat farther. Across the street, Richard slammed his palm against the steering wheel and then froze, unable to turn the key, unable to drive away. The geometry had spread too far, claiming road and curb as though memory required expansion. In the attic, the grip shifted. Michael's wrist was no longer merely enclosed. It was anchored, as if a new axis had been installed through his arm, a hinge binding him to the phantom frame. He sagged forward, eyes wide, the whites threaded with red. His chest rose in gasps that matched the chain's rhythm. Each breath, another swing forward. Laura refused release, clutching him tighter, and the grip on her wrists deepened, linking her pulse to his. She felt the same hinge setting into her bones, a fulcrum not of flesh, but of repetition. Daniel stepped closer, his bare feet silent on the dust-drifted floor. He stood beneath his parents, his small hands lifting as though to join, though no one had invited him. The invisible arc swelled, wider, stronger, filling the hallway with pressure that bent the walls outward. Above, the attic frame groaned, a sound like trees bending under storm, but no wind followed it. Dust rained harder, coating Daniel's hair in pale gray, until he resembled a figure already claimed by memory. The sound arrived again, laughter, broken and high, layered in echoes, until it resembled a chant. It did not come from one place, but from every place. The attic void, the hallway walls, the photographs, the chalk outside. It carried no malice. It carried only insistence. The game had waited long enough. Laura's grip faltered under the weight of inevitability. Her vision dimmed at the edges. She felt the cold, not just on her skin, but behind her ribs, around her lungs, inside the rhythm of her own blood. The house had folded her into its cadence. Another participant corrected into place. She closed her eyes against the dust, and when she opened them again, she saw not plaster, not rafters, not paint, but a playground unending, swings multiplied into horizon, each chain moving in perfect time. Her scream finally broke through, not into the house, but into that vision. It echoed across rows of empty swings that were not empty, across shadows that were not shadows. It was the only sound that did not match rhythm, the only sound that defied cadence. And in that defiance, the grip around her wrist snapped tighter, pulling her upward into the dark. The dark took her as a surface takes ink. Temperature replaced touch. Laura rose into the attic void until dust met her eyelashes and settled like cold ash. The grip around her wrist did not bruise. It calibrated. Each throb of pulse fed it information, and it returned a counter-pressure that taught her blood how to keep time. Beneath her, the hallway narrowed to a strip of dim lemon light, and the thin figure of Daniel beneath the split ceiling, his hair powdered gray, and his chest rising in a cadence not entirely his. Michael hovered between floors, a hinge through which the house balanced its new geometry. The attic's interior arranged itself by suggestion rather than material. Two darker pillars marked the idea of posts. Between them hung a rectangle of colder air, the exact width of a seat. The silence there possessed texture, a grain like frost on glass. Each time Laura's lungs filled, the grain rasped lightly, whisper against whisper, shadow against breath. In the distance, the house's second heartbeat continued, chain against chain, a delicate metronome that had outlived the wood that once held it. Across the street, Evelyn stepped down to her walkway and paused. Her body leaned forward like a needle, searching for signal. The chalk pattern had crossed the asphalt by now. Faint white echo of boxes stenciled into night. Richard's headlights remained off, but a small glow from his dashboard cast a sickly green over his hands. The neighborhood held still, the way abandoned places hold still, a hush that is not peace, but vacancy. Laura's body discovered the rule by accident. When panic shortened her breath, the grip tightened. When she lengthened the inhale to match the swing's imaginary arc, the grip relaxed. The lesson arrived complete. Repetition was welcomed, asymmetry punished. The mechanism wanted sameness. It wanted pairs, mirrors, returns. The half-removed playground had trained the yard to repeat until completion. The incomplete removal had taught the house to repeat completion itself. Presence had turned into program. Below, Daniel lifted one hand. The invisible arc feathered his sleeve with cold. His fingers moved in small counts, the same sequence he had penciled into his drawings, numbers layered over numbers until paper tore. He took a measured step forward into the dust and found a square that should not exist. The runner's fibers lay combed in a tiny ladder that only revealed itself when weight respected its rhythm. His heel dragged a fraction on the final box, smearing one edge by instinct rather than plan. The swing stuttered. The temperature in Laura's wrist altered by an imperceptible degree that her bones nevertheless read as meaning. Michael sagged against the ladder and recovered 1 inch. The cold corrected him with patience, then yielded back the inch as if acknowledging effort while refusing outcome. Sweat froze on his hairline. Tiny crystals formed in the fine hairs of his forearm and broke like sugar when he moved. The smell of iron deepened. It was not blood. It was chain, wet wood, night air applied to memory as varnish. The photographs downstairs responded. Their scattered faces curled as if warmed by a flame that did not exist. One slid across the floor with the deliberate speed of a plan. Its image wavered, then sharpened. The yard in clean daylight, the frame centered, the window behind it heavy with shadow. Where a child's face would have been, the gloss held only density. The picture stopped at the base of the stairs and waited, a flat witness that had learned how to move. Wind still refused the street, yet a draft formed along the hallway as if footsteps had walked through the house and left a path for air to follow. Laura felt it and understood that movement was accruing even when nothing moved. The house added up repetitions like a curse disguised as math. The sum sought an answer in bodies. Daniel turned. The doll shoe he had curated on his windowsill had fallen, toe out against the baseboard, its leather darkened by breath on cold glass. He picked it up with both hands, tiny ritual, and stepped into the ark again. The shoe was not heavy, but it contained a density of reference the mechanism recognized. He lifted it to the exact height where a seat would pass, and held it steady. Air parted around it, the way a river parts around a stone. Laura's wrist loosened by a fraction. The cold did not recede. It remeasured. The band felt the object below, and altered tension like a weight distribution across a paired swing. The invisible seat brushed the shoe and accepted its presence as occupying a participant. A rule had been satisfied. The rope that was not a rope relaxed enough for breath to return without instruction. The attic exhaled. A soft flurry descended through the hatch, a fine powder-like chalk shaved to smoke. It traced ellipses around Laura's forearms and Michael's shoulders and Daniel's upturned face. In those pale tracks, the pattern revealed itself again. Pairs, reflections, a map of arcs seeking another arc to complete itself. The ceiling indentation in the foyer deepened a shade. The front door widened its inch by another inch and then stopped, as if a new measurement had been met. Outside, the yard accepted the substitution. The chalk ladder dimmed one step and brightened another. The rectangle at the swing's path elongated toward the porch. The frame's shadow lengthened, though the moon had not changed. Across the street, Evelyn raised one hand to her throat and stilled it there. A human pause placed like a paperweight on panic. Richard's fingers left the steering wheel and found the glove compartment latch, then froze again when the metronome click-threaded his car interior, as clearly as if a chain had been strung from mirror to mirror. Laura's mind offered an image uninvited. 2 children in an empty lot, one missing, one waiting. The game suspended mid-arc decades ago and never released. No body, no scream, no proof. Just repetition parked on a rusting frame and a house that learned to keep time in case anyone returned. The horror was not appetite, but patience. The terror was not malice, but maintenance. She tested defiance. She held her breath in prime numbers and flexed her fingers out of sequence. The band tightened until bone ached, then held steady, denying pain the dignity of crescendo. When she surrendered to even counts again, the ache dissolved to numbing cold. The mechanism did not punish cruelty. It punished variance. Daniel moved again. He placed the doll shoe on the floor beneath the final box in the invisible ladder, toe pointed toward the attic opening like a compass needle. He pressed his heel into the smudged edge he had made earlier and dragged it deliberately across the mark until the square lost a corner. The swing hesitated a full beat this time. Silence opened between clicks, a thin slice of night with no sound at all, pure absence like the black between stars. Into that slice, Laura pushed one shoulder against the cold. The ring resisted, then slipped a breath's width as though the rule had blinked. Michael took the same inch. The ladder feet scraped and found new purchase. One rung creaked with a timbre like chain on hook. Dust fell thicker, threads becoming curtains in miniature. The attic posts that were not posts leaned closer together by suggestion, and the rectangle of colder air narrowed as if a decision approached. On the street, a porch light 2 houses down flicked on and off 3 times. The sequence had no author. It matched the stutter in the hallway. It matched the stutter in Laura's pulse. It matched the pause Daniel had cut into chalk. The neighborhood's silence bruised and held. The photograph at the stair base seemed to roll in place, not forward, not back, like a coin deciding whether to fall flat. Its gloss caught the tiniest reflection from the upstairs hall and returned it as a thin beam into the attic opening. The beam touched Laura's cheek and warmed nothing. Still, the light made an outline where the cold had no right to be, a faint border around the invisible seat, an aura that did not heat, but named. Naming altered everything. The house shivered, not in wood, not in glass, but in plan. For 1 second, the rhythm lost its invisible conductor. The clicks separated, the arcs forgot their meeting point, the double smear in every photograph misaligned. Laura pushed again into the inch the pause had allowed. Michael followed with a grunt that existed only as motion. Daniel pinched the last intact corner of the final square with his heel and erased it with a grind that sounded like paper tearing in a quiet room. The mechanism noticed. Rules altered with the offended grace of a ceremony interrupted. The ring on Laura's wrist slipped to her palm and then reclosed above the knuckles, narrower, colder, more precise. The attic frame leaned not forward, but down, as if the invisible seat intended to meet the child instead of the adult. Air thickened around Daniel's shoulders with the weightless weight of expectation. The swing chose continuity over release. Laura understood the exchange as clearly as if someone had spoken into her ear. One participant could be traded for another to preserve the geometry. The band tightened in approval of comprehension. The house did not need all 3. It needed 2. She looked down into the dim hallway that had lengthened into a corridor of echoes, at the small rectangle of leather toe-out on the floor, at the erased corner in the dust, at the boy standing exactly where a rule wanted him. Silence expanded again, thin and sharp. The second heartbeat waited for the next count. The night held its temperature like a held breath. Laura bent her wrist inside the ring until bone pressed bone, and without words, without movement that showed, made a choice that counted as motion. The grip let her go and closed around Daniel instead. The release struck Laura like surf, pulling back from shore. Weight returned to her wrists in a rush that burned. Heat following cold, the way blood follows a pinch. The absence snapped shut around Daniel with a precision that felt administrative rather than cruel, a rule applied rather than a choice made. His shoulders tightened, not in pain but in compliance, and the invisible arc adjusted to the lighter body with the elegant correction of a pendulum finding its center. Michael held the ladder as if bracing a door against weather. The ring on his own wrist slackened to a bracelet of chill, attentive but undecided. Above, the attic void clarified into suggestion again. Posts mapped by shadow, seat mapped by cold, chains mapped by the thin quiver drawn across the air. Dust continued to fall in threads, each strand a pale measure that named the swing's path without showing it. The hallway lamp hummed in a pitch that matched the metronome click. The front door remained open, night carved into the house like a ruler pressed into clay. Daniel's breath synchronized instantly. His chest rose in counts that did not belong to sleep. The small shoe on the floor below the final square pointed at the hatch like a compass needle nailed to north. The erased corner of dust widened as air moved in a curve that denied straight lines. Laura felt the memory of the ring still ghosting her bones and understood what the rule had done. The mechanism had selected a lighter participant to reduce strain, to ensure rhythm continued without interruption. The game protected itself first. Evelyn Carter stepped off the curb as if answering a bell only she could hear. She crossed the empty street in short, sure steps that left no sound. Chalk dust clinging to the hem of her nightcoat like a frost. The geometry met her halfway, boxes fading at her feet, then brightening behind, as though the street itself permitted passage once counted. She paused at the open door, a hand steady on the rail, and looked inward with the expression of someone recognizing furniture in a room that used to be hers. She entered without announcement. Richard Lee left the car with the caution of a man stepping into water that might be deeper than it looks. He carried nothing, then returned to the trunk and reached for a coil of nylon rope, the only thing there that resembled the idea of a chain without being metal. The coil was new and smelled of synthetic fiber and dustless plastic. He hesitated, then looped it between the porch columns in a wide U, as if offering the house a placeholder for what it wanted. The rope did not move. The air around it cooled by a degree, acknowledging effort, declining substitution. Inside, Laura moved with the economy of someone who has burned through panic and emerged into decision. She gathered the scattered papers by the stairs, the municipal letter with its gray seal, the map on the index card, the photographs with their blurred arcs. She laid them beneath the attic opening one by one, until the floor held a paper version of the yard. The phrase "work incomplete" faced up from the center like a verdict that had learned how to wait. She tore the letter along its crease and placed the halves against the walls, where the invisible bands of cold brushed past, a cross through a rectangle, completing on paper what the map had promised, but the crew had never done. The effect was small, but immediate. The metronome stuttered by a hair. The dust threads thickened, as if the air had drawn a breath. Michael shifted on the ladder and regained an inch that the mechanism returned a heartbeat later. The rule was noticing, not persuaded. Evelyn's hands emerged from the pockets of her coat, holding a stub of chalk, worn down to the width of a pencil lead. She knelt on the foyer tile and drew the ladder of boxes that should have met the porch steps decades ago. The chalk whispered against ceramic, a dry hiss that the house answered with a thin tap from somewhere above. She connected the final box to the threshold in a small arc that curved where a right angle would usually sit. The curve matched the invisible seat's arc, a courtesy to motion. On the street, the night thickened with the smell of wet wood and old metal. A distant transformer hummed in a monotone. No cars passed. No wind shifted branches. The neighborhood had consented to stillness the way a body consents to anesthesia. Richard tightened the rope between the columns until it thumbed, then stepped away and listened. The sound did not match the chain's pitch. The house ignored it. He dropped the coil so it hung slack, and the moment it lost tension, the front door shivered inward by a fraction, as if preference had been tested and recorded. Daniel lifted from the floor in increments no eye could see, but every nerve could sense. His heels brushed carpet fibers that recalled pressure a second after it left. His hands hovered in the air at the height where the invisible seat asked for them. His head tilted, eyelashes catching dust that glittered and melted on his skin. His lips shaped counts one could read without hearing. The swing accepted him with a tenderness that made Laura's stomach fold. This was not appetite. This was curation. Michael made a choice that showed only as motion. He reached into the attic with his free hand and pressed his palm flat against the rectangle of colder air where the seat floated. He did not push. He matched. The ring answered with relief, as if a misaligned gear had found its tooth. The arc above deepened by a degree, the arc below lightened by the same degree. The house balanced total movement like a ledger. Laura stepped into the invisible ladder at Daniel's feet and placed her soles in the first 2 boxes, then the next, counting breaths rather than numbers. When she reached the last box where the edge had been erased, she dragged her heel across the smudge again until the square resolved into a circle. The circle was imperfect and wobbled. It did not match the rigid ladders elsewhere. The rule disliked variance. The cold rose in objection. She stood her ground. The circle was not defiance only. It was completion of a different shape. The photographs on the floor curled as if warmed, then flattened. The Polaroid from the porch shifted until the smear of the old swing hovered exactly beneath the attic opening. The image bent in the dim like oil on water, and for a blink, 2 arcs crossed at their peaks, a thin lens of overlap that felt like an eye-opening. Richard stepped into the doorway and stopped as the temperature dropped. He saw the chalk pattern touch the threshold and then disappear across tile under Evelyn's hand, each box brightening as the nub of chalk passed. He did not speak. He reached into his folder and removed a thin metal tag stamped with a serial number left over from a forgotten inspection. He placed it on the floor beside the municipal letters torn halves. The number gleamed dully. The house recognized the brass, the way a body recognizes a key shape pressed against skin. The tap above altered pitch. Daniel's feet left the carpet by a distance no thicker than a shadow. The swing's acceptance deepened. Laura felt the ring that was not a ring tightening again, now around a limb, not her own. She stepped farther into the circle she had drawn and stood directly beneath him. The cold stepped with her. When she lifted both arms, the temperature shifted, meeting her halfway, evaluating, deciding. She had offered a pair again. The mechanism smoothed. Evelyn rose from the floor and pressed her palm flat over the word incomplete. Chalk dust whitened her skin in a print that looked like frost. She lifted her hand and left behind the shape of 5 fingers in negative on the paper. The letters beneath faded as if erased by a slow breath. The tap above paused for the length of 1 inhalation. The house appeared to consider a conclusion it had never granted. Michael bowed into the attic seat until his shoulder joints ached. The ring on his wrist tightened with cooperative satisfaction rather than punishment. He became weight in a system that wanted weight. Daniel's small body eased, the string around his ribs loosening to a curve that matched a mother's arms, though no arms were there. Laura felt the window of chance open the width of a pulse. She moved through it. She bent her knees and lifted Daniel by the hips while the invisible seat completed its forward pass. The ring that had claimed him tightened in protest, then evaluated the arithmetic and seized her wrist instead, choosing mass, that satisfied pattern. Daniel dropped into her arms, weight returning with a hot rush. The grip climbed her radius like ice poured into a cast. The swing accepted the exchange because repetition had been preserved. Michael felt the transfer as a click in the bones. The attic arc surged in relief. The hallway arc lost urgency. Dust fell less like rain and more like snow, flakes drifting and melting on contact. His legs shook with the effort of holding both the ladder and the seat that had no weight, and all the weight at once. The photograph at the stair base stopped rolling and lay flat, image clear for the first time. It showed the yard with 2 swings, not by duplication but by echo. The second fashioned from glare and absence, a ghost seat perfected by light. Daniel's chest stuttered. A cough lifted chalk from his lips in a pale puff. His eyes cleared, pupils shrinking back to mortal size. He clung without choosing who to cling to. Laura buried her face in his hair for the time it took to count to 4, and then lifted him away. setting him against the wall outside the invisible path. The cold followed her wrists instead of her son. The mechanism had what it needed. Evelyn turned to the door and raised both hands. She stepped backward along the chalk ladder, erasing each box with the sole of her shoe as she went, undoing the invitation now that the transaction had concluded. The chalk smeared into ghost shapes that refused to hold edges. At the threshold, she blew the last dust from her fingers and stood aside. Outside, the yard resumed its long patience, swing moving in measured arcs as if nothing had happened. Richard gathered the papers with the efficiency of someone packing a crime scene that required no police. He did not disturb the brass tag. He slid the municipal letter halves together until the tear met its twin, then set a palm over the seam to steady it. The phrase lost its space and became a single word in his mind. The house declined to read it. Laura waited for pain to rise and found only numbness that carried a hint of relief. The ring around her wrist tightened into certainty. She stood beneath the attic opening where dust continued to fall and understood the cost the way one understands a price posted clearly in the window of a shop. The mechanism did not ask. It offered terms. A pair to complete the cycle. A participant to replace the child. A game to end because it had been allowed to finish once. Michael descended one rung. The seat above followed, invisible but obedient, the arc translating into distance along the ladder. The chain's click, now timed to the tap of aluminum feet, shifting across wood. The house adjusted dimensions to keep path and instrument aligned. Laura stepped with him, matching the cadence exactly, feeling the ring tighten with every correct count, and refused to explore pain. Compliance brought numbness. Non-compliance would bring cold sharp enough to cut. At the foyer, Evelyn placed the chalk nub on the photograph face down, as if pressing a seal. The air warmed by a degree that no thermostat would record. The front door eased inward another inch, and then halted, as though reaching an agreed-upon mark. Beyond it, the night remained watchful, not hostile. The rope between the porch columns hung slack and useless, a symbol that would never be invited to stand for the thing it imitated. Daniel found his breath in small, ragged sips that smoothed into normalcy by slow degrees. He kept his eyes on the place where the circle of dust had been, and toyed with the doll shoe, turning it until the toe pointed not toward the attic, but toward the closed window. His small chest rose on his own timing, his shoulders lowered to their natural angle. The house paid him no attention. The ring had moved on. Michael reached the floor. He did not let go of the ladder. Laura stood one step beneath the hatch, arms loose at her sides. The invisible band anchored now above her wrist like a cuff cast from winter. The arc continued through her, seat passing as close as skin without touching. Air displaced enough to lift the hairs on her forearm in waves. The house closed itself around the new arrangement, the way water closes around a hand. There was no triumph. There was only completion. A memory of steel forgotten by the people who had left it. A removal abandoned halfway. A house attentive enough to learn. A family that had entered at the wrong angle. A neighborhood that had been practicing stillness for years. Evelyn stood very straight and looked at Laura the way a person looks at a traveler boarding a train that will not return. She lifted one hand, as if to say a word, and lowered it, not for lack of language, but because the house had declared words unnecessary. She stepped back over the ladder of boxes she had erased, her shoes brushing chalk into pale halos that clung to the tile, and then surrendered to air. She crossed the threshold and paused on the porch as the night collected her. Richard gathered the rope and coiled it again, a domestic motion that put away a tool that had never been used. He slid the coil into the trunk, closed it gently, and leaned his forehead against the cool metal for one measured breath. When he straightened, the block's silence accepted him as part of itself. He did not look back through the open door. He did not need to. The rhythm had returned to normal, which was to say it had returned to itself. Inside, the attic dark, eased by a shade, not brighter, but less endless. The dust fell in slower threads. The cold around Laura's wrist settled into a constant pressure, a weight that felt like the memory of jewelry. Michael moved closer and stood at her shoulder, his body making a wall against the hallway's length. He did not touch her. He understood pressure and counter-pressure now. He understood that touching the ring would not change it. He understood that standing was the only act left that counted. The swing outside continued. The chain's click counted the night. The chalk faded from tile like breath, wiped from glass. The brass tag lay against paper and warmed a degree from the heat of living bodies, though no hand touched it. The photograph on the floor dried flat and kept its new image. Hours smeared into one another. The house held them. The neighborhood's lights turned off one by one, obedient to schedules that had not accounted for this task. Somewhere a dog barked and then lost interest. Somewhere a transformer clicked and held. The cold never left Laura's wrist. It did not need to. The rule had been satisfied, in a way the rule preferred. When dawn came, it came early by a color, rather than by a time. Gray lifted from black, with the soft haste of condensation evaporating. The swing outside did not stop. It did not need wind. It never had. The seat inside continued through the hallway, invisible and exact, a second heartbeat the house had adopted. Michael brewed coffee that cooled before drinking. Daniel slept on the couch, head propped on a folded blanket, breath steady and human and unmeasured by any chain. Evelyn returned home at the speed of someone who knows every crack in the sidewalk by memory. Richard drove away at a careful pace, checking his mirrors as if mirrors mattered. By noon, the cold had learned the pulse of Laura's veins so well that she no longer felt separate from it. She stood where the ring told her to stand, and stepped when the arc asked her to step. The house rewarded her with clean silence between clicks, a space wide enough to think. In that space, she understood why the photograph had changed, and why the chalk had obeyed, and why the letter had refused to mean what it had said. Removal defines what remains as much as what is taken. The swing was not an object, it was a habit. Habits become houses when given walls and time. A day became two in the mind, if not in the clock. The neighborhood resumed its surface rituals. Lawns were watered, the trash cans migrated, curtains opened and closed on schedule. The swing continued. The second swing continued. The ring did not loosen. The family learned the perimeter of motion and kept furniture clear without remark. The room adapted around the path, the way a stream adapts around a stone. At dusk, on the second evening, the wind finally returned, a soft inland breath that touched leaves and raised a shiver across hedges. The outside frame accepted the wind as if greeting an old friend it did not need. The chain's pitch changed by a fraction, and then returned to its chosen key. In the upstairs hallway, the lamp flickered once and settled. The circle Laura had ground into dust 2 nights earlier had faded to a suggestion. Yet every time her eyes passed over that patch of carpet, the illusion of roundness persisted, as if the fibers had learned a curve. Across the street, a realtor's sign listed another house with a new price on a bright card. A family drove by slowly, heads turning in quiet calculation, children's faces pressed to glass. The car's engine idled. The driver's hand pointed at the yard with the swing, because the yard looked generous and the swing looked nostalgic, and the fence looked safe. The car rolled on. The sign rocked in a wind that had already moved on. In the Johnson hallway, the click of chain against chain marked the seconds in a ledger no human kept. The ring around Laura's wrist did not pulse anymore. It did not need to remind. It had become a fact, like a wall. Michael stood with her when standing mattered, and sat with her when sitting was permitted. Daniel learned the rooms that the Ark ignored, and spent his hours there, building cities from quiet objects and listening to the safe hum of the refrigerator, like a seashell at his ear. Night came again with less announcement than before. The open front door had long since been closed to a mathematically exact angle that the house preferred. The brass tag had dimmed from fingerprints that did not exist. The photographs remained face up and uncooperative, their images set in arrangements no one had taken. The municipal letter held its tear as if refusing to be one piece or two. The chalk nub on the Polaroid wore to nothing. Across the block, 2 porches farther down, another frame that had once been a swing waited in an uncut yard. Posts leaned slightly toward each other like old men in consultation. No one had played there in years. No one had removed it when removal was ordered. The wind reached it at last. The chain stirred, a single link kissing a hook with the intimacy of recognition. The air above the nearest hallway in that house cooled by a degree. Afternoons would feel shorter there soon. Nights would lengthen. A second heartbeat would arrive, and then another, and then another. Street by street, house by house, as memory found structure to inhabit, and patience found rooms to settle. Laura stood under the hatch and counted to 4 because 4 kept the ring content. The house breathed around her in the way a house breathes when it has chosen its task. Outside, the swing traced its arc across the rectangle the yard could not forget. Inside, the invisible seat moved through air that now carried a path the way dirt carries a rut. The neighborhood listened the way abandoned places listen. The night pressed in the way water presses at depth. The rules stayed simple: pairs, repetition, return. And on the 3rd night, when a car slowed in front of the house with the sign, and a child's hands pressed against glass, the hallway light in that other house flickered once with no hand on any switch, and a chill banded a small wrist with a patience that did not require consent, and the chain on the old frame down the block kissed the hook again and held. By morning, every hallway on the block carried the faint groove of a seat that had never been there, and with that, their story came to an end. But it leaves one last question for you. If the swing outside your home kept moving on its own every night, would you dare look closer? Share your answer in the comments below. See you in the next one.